It was a calm Sunday afternoon in Peru on the 31st of May, 1970. Around 3:20 in the afternoon local time, people were going about their day. Some were relaxing after lunch, others were at church, and many in coastal towns like Chimbote and Casma were finishing their weekend chores. But without warning, the ground began to shake, hard. The shaking lasted just under 1 minute, around 45 seconds in total, but what it left behind was absolute devastation. The earthquake struck off the coast of north-central Peru about 25 kilometers west of the port city of Chimbote in the Pacific Ocean. The area where the quake started is part of a dangerous geological zone where the Nazca tectonic plate is slowly moving under the South American plate. This is what geologists call a subduction zone, and it's known for producing powerful earthquakes. On that day, the tectonic stress reached its breaking point, and the result was a massive undersea quake with a moment magnitude of 7.9. Even though the epicenter was out in the ocean, the quake's effects were felt across a massive area, roughly 83,000 square kilometers. That's an area larger than the size of Belgium and the Netherlands combined. It wasn't just Peru that felt it either. Parts of Ecuador to the north felt the tremors, and even western Brazil, deep in the Amazon, reported some shaking. From Tumbes in the north to Iquitos in the east and down past Pisco, the entire country was shaken. In Peru's capital, Lima, located over 400 miles from the epicenter, buildings swayed and people panicked. The shock even caused damage in parts of Trujillo, the third largest city in the country, although it was less severe there. The worst damage was concentrated in two regions, Ancash and southern La Libertad. These regions include the rugged Andes Mountains, as well as towns and villages along the coast. And here's the thing, this earthquake didn't just cause buildings to fall, it set off one of the most terrifying chain reactions in modern history. The power of the shaking triggered something even deadlier than the quake itself, but that part comes later. For now, in the immediate aftermath of the tremors, entire towns were left in rubble. Homes made of adobe bricks, which are common in the region, crumbled instantly. These structures aren't built to withstand strong quakes, especially on unstable soil, which many of these towns were built on. The combination was deadly. Phone lines were down, roads cracked open or were completely blocked by debris. The Pan American Highway, which runs through the region and is a major lifeline for transportation and aid, was heavily damaged. That alone would cause major problems in the hours to come, especially when it came to getting help to where it was needed most. People ran into the streets, many barefoot and still in their Sunday clothes, trying to find family members, help neighbors, or just understand what had happened. In some towns, nearly everything was flattened. In places like Carhuaz and Riqué, between 80 to 90% of buildings were destroyed. Hospitals, schools, water lines, power stations, gone. It was more than just destruction, it was complete infrastructure failure. This was not just a local emergency, it was a nationwide crisis. The Peruvian government scrambled to get information, but communication systems were barely functioning. And no one knew yet just how bad things really were in the mountain valleys to the east, especially in a place called Yungay. In the hours that followed, aftershocks rumbled through the region, keeping people on edge. The fear wasn't just about the shaking continuing, it was about what would come next. Because while the earthquake was terrible on its own, it was only the beginning of what would become the worst natural disaster in Peru's history. In the hours following the earthquake on the 31st of May, 1970, the scale of the disaster was still unclear. Communication systems were down across much of northern and central Peru, and entire towns were cut off. But as word slowly spread, it became clear that something even worse had happened in the highlands, specifically in the area near Mount Huascarán, the tallest mountain in all of Peru. Mount Huascarán stands more than 22,000 feet above sea level and is covered in glaciers year-round. When the earthquake hit, it sent powerful vibrations through the mountain's northern face. That pressure caused a massive section of rock and ice to break loose. What began as a fracture quickly turned into a roaring avalanche, one of the deadliest in human history. The falling mass of glacial ice, snow, rock, and debris formed what's known as a debris avalanche. It started high up on the mountain in a steep and heavily glaciated area. Within seconds, a wide chunk of the slope, over 900 meters across and 1.5 kilometers long, ripped free. As it tumbled downhill, it picked up speed fast. It wasn't just falling, it was racing. Estimates say it moved at more than 280 kilometers per hour and may have reached speeds over 330 kilometers per hour as it descended. By the time it neared the valley below, this avalanche had turned into a deadly wave of ice, rock, mud, and snow. It carried an estimated 80 million cubic meters of material. That's enough to fill over 30,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And it was heading straight for the village of Yungay. Yungay was a peaceful town located in the Callejon de Huaylas Valley. Before the earthquake, it was home to about 20,000 people. The town sat beneath Mount Huascarán's looming peak, and many residents believed the snow-covered mountain was a symbol of protection. But on that day, the mountain became the very thing that destroyed them. When the avalanche reached Yungay, it hit with such force that it buried the entire town in a matter of seconds. Homes, streets, cars, and families were all swept away. Some people tried to run, but there was almost no time. The only survivors were those who happened to be in the town's cemetery, located on a small hill that the avalanche didn't reach, and a few children who had been taken to a stadium just outside the town. Nearby, the village of Ronrohirka was also hit. It had already been partially destroyed by a previous avalanche 10 years earlier in 1960. Now it was struck again, and this time, the destruction was even worse. Entire communities vanished beneath the wave of debris. It wasn't just the physical destruction that made this avalanche so deadly. The volume of snow and rock, combined with the incredible speed and weight, meant that few structures, if any, could withstand the impact. And because the avalanche happened so quickly after the earthquake, there was no warning system, no alert, and no way for people to get to higher ground in time. In the days that followed, rescue teams struggled to reach Yungay. Roads were gone, power lines were down, and even air rescue was difficult due to poor visibility and blocked terrain. When they finally reached the site, they found what looked like a wasteland. No sign of the town, only a thick blanket of mud and rocks covering everything. The Peruvian government later declared the area where Yungay once stood a national cemetery. Digging and excavation were not allowed, both out of respect for the thousands who died and because recovery was nearly impossible. Families were left without closure. Entire generations were lost. The avalanche wasn't just a result of the earthquake, it was also a reflection of how vulnerable mountainous regions can be, especially when glaciers and unstable slopes are involved. Mount Huascarán had long been a stunning natural landmark, but that day it became the center of a disaster that would leave a permanent scar on Peru's history. As the nation tried to grasp the tragedy, attention began to shift toward the larger picture. What had happened across Ancash and La Libertad was far more than just a series of collapsed buildings. It was a complete breakdown of entire communities. Next, we'll look at the wider impact across the country, including the humanitarian crisis that followed. After the earthquake and the avalanche devastated the regions of Ancash and La Libertad on the 31st of May 1970, Peru found itself facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in its history. The destruction was so widespread that entire districts were isolated and help was slow to arrive. The country was in shock, but in the days that followed, the focus shifted toward rescue, recovery, and survival. More than 83,000 square kilometers had been affected. That's an area larger than the size of many countries, including Belgium. The destruction reached far beyond Yungay and the nearby towns. In fact, reports of damage came from as far north as Tumbes and as far south as Pisco. The tremors were felt as far east as Iquitos, deep in the jungle. Even some parts of western Brazil and southern Ecuador reported mild shaking. In the coastal city of Chimbote, which was one of the largest urban centers in the region, nearly 90% of buildings were destroyed. The port was heavily damaged and fishing operations came to a halt. Nearby cities like Casma, Arme, and Soup also saw entire blocks flattened. These were not just homes, these were schools, hospitals, government buildings, and markets. Nothing was spared. Up in the mountains, the damage was just as severe. In places like Carhuaz, Reque, and Ija, the quake wiped out nearly all infrastructure. In many areas, adobe brick homes simply crumbled. These buildings had no reinforcements and weren't built to handle seismic activity. That made them especially dangerous, and thousands of people were crushed beneath the rubble. Transportation came to a standstill. The Pan American Highway, Peru's main coastal road, was cut off in multiple locations. This slowed down aid and made it nearly impossible to reach certain towns quickly. In the Santa River Valley, the Cañon del Pato hydroelectric plant was damaged, causing blackouts and cutting power to large parts of the region. The railway that connected Chimbote to the interior was also ruined. About 60% of that rail line became unusable overnight. By the second day, the Peruvian government began to understand how serious the situation really was. But with communication lines down and many towns still unreachable, organizing rescue efforts was incredibly difficult. Military helicopters were sent to drop food and supplies where they could, but the demand was overwhelming. Survivors were digging through rubble with their bare hands, hoping to find loved ones or recover anything that had been spared. International aid began pouring in almost immediately. Countries from around the world offered support. The United States played a major role, and First Lady Pat Nixon even traveled to Peru herself. She brought relief supplies, visited hospitals, and helped bring attention to the needs of the people affected by the disaster. Planes filled with food, medicine, blankets, and rescue equipment arrived in Lima and were transported north as quickly as possible. But even with global support, recovery was slow. The scale of the destruction made logistics a nightmare. There were not enough vehicles, fuel, or equipment to get aid where it was needed fast enough. Some towns went without help for days. People were sleeping in the open, drinking unsafe water, and struggling to find food. Diseases began to spread, especially among children and the elderly. In many places, local communities stepped up, farmers donated crops, churches opened their doors, and volunteers helped coordinate aid drops. But the trauma ran deep. Families had been wiped out, homes were gone, entire neighborhoods had simply vanished. As days turned into weeks, the country faced another painful reality: the economic cost. Estimates put the losses at more than $500 million, a devastating figure for Peru at the time. Industries shut down, jobs disappeared, and with thousands of people displaced, there was a growing need for long-term shelter and support. Despite the destruction, the people of Peru showed incredible resilience. There were acts of courage, unity, and compassion that stood out amid the devastation. Still, it was clear that recovery would take years, not months. As we wrap up, we'll explore how Peru responded in the years after the disaster, the changes made to laws, safety standards, and disaster preparedness, and how the tragedy left a lasting legacy, not just in Peru, but around the world. In the years after the Ancash earthquake of May 31st, 1970, Peru slowly began the long process of rebuilding. The disaster had not only shaken the ground, but had also exposed deep weaknesses in how the country prepared for natural catastrophes. What came next was a period of reflection, reform, and an effort to make sure a tragedy of that scale would never happen again. One of the most immediate and permanent decisions made by the Peruvian government was to preserve the site of Yungay. The town had been completely buried under millions of cubic meters of mud, rock, and ice, and recovery was impossible. The government declared the area a national cemetery. No excavation was allowed. The ruins, frozen in time, became a place of remembrance. Only a few landmarks remained above the surface, including the top of the church and a handful of palm trees. Those who had survived, mostly children who had been at the stadium on higher ground, were relocated, and the town was never rebuilt. The disaster left such a deep mark on the country that in the year 2000, Peru officially established May 31st as Natural Disaster Education and Reflection Day. On this day, schools across the country practice earthquake drills and learn about what happened in 1970. The goal is to pass on the memory of the event and to teach new generations how to react if it ever happens again. It became a part of the country's identity, an annual reminder of both loss and resilience. In terms of policy, building codes in Peru were updated. Before the earthquake, many structures had been made from adobe and lacked reinforcement. After seeing how quickly these buildings crumbled, especially in rural areas, new regulations were introduced. The government pushed for safer construction methods, especially in earthquake-prone regions. Over time, cities began replacing old infrastructure and investing in materials better able to withstand seismic activity. The tragedy also led to improvements in emergency response systems. Before 1970, there had been little coordination between military, medical, and civil services during disasters. The chaos in the days after the quake made it clear that this needed to change. The Peruvian government created new emergency management agencies, set up plans for disaster zones, and invested in training programs for search and rescue teams. Globally, the event had a lasting impact on how landslides and avalanches were studied. The Huascarán avalanche became a case study in high mountain risk zones. Scientists around the world studied what had happened in Peru, analyzing the speed and force of the debris flow that had destroyed Yungay. It helped researchers understand how rock and ice can mix to form incredibly deadly slides. This knowledge would later be used in other mountainous countries like Nepal, Pakistan, and parts of the Alps to monitor glacial areas for signs of collapse. The earthquake also pushed forward conversations about early warning systems. In 1970, Peru had no seismic warning system in place. People had no idea what was coming. Since then, countries across Latin America and around the world began investing in seismometers and alert networks. These systems are now able to detect early tremors and give people seconds or even minutes to prepare. Though Peru has faced other earthquakes since then, none have matched the sheer scale of the Ancash disaster. More than 50 years later, it remains the worst natural catastrophe in the country's history. Estimates place the number of deaths between 66,000 and 70,000 people, most of them taken not by the quake itself, but by the enormous landslide that followed. But while the physical scars of the disaster have faded in many places, the memory lives on. In Yungay, a memorial sits where the town once stood, surrounded by flowers and the rusted remains of vehicles swallowed by the avalanche. It's quiet there now. But the story of that day in 1970 continues to be told, not just in Peru, but around the world, as a reminder of nature's power and the importance of being prepared. That day changed Peru forever, and the lessons it taught are still shaping how we face disasters today.